celebrated today. Today's topic is about extension options available for data archival and long-term retention within Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. Presenting for us today from Microsoft along with me, we have Purvesh Vagasia, Senior Solution Architect, Ajay Kumar Singh, Principal Solution Architect. With that, Ajay, over to you to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Shirish. Let's get this started. So the agenda that we have today is about the extension option that we have for archiving and long-term retention framework. We'll talk about certain customization options that we have with the data archiving scenarios. We will have a couple of demos, and then in the end, we will have a time for Q&A. So as part of the series of the tech talks that we have been doing for the data archival, we have delivered two tech talks. One that we delivered on 22nd, which was mostly around D365 Finance and Operation apps archiving at high level that we talked about. Then we had a second session which was more focused on CE apps, which we delivered on 23rd of May. And now this, as part of that series, today's session is more about going a little bit deeper on the Finance and Operation apps, or how do we go for an extension and customization option if I had to with an existing framework. So again, before we go to the deeper in the scenario, we just wanted to touch base on some of the scenario that is available so that it's kind of clear when we mention about these scenarios in the tech talk. So like in public preview with 10.0.39, we have general ledger, sales order, inventory transactions, inventory journals, and tax trans, which is available in the public preview. We are also planning to make retail transactions as well in public preview or private preview for limited sort of customers. In 40, it might change, so we don't have a firm timelines on that one, but it's going to come up. Going to the different options and scenario for the extensions, right? So there are three different options or scenario that we have for an extension of existing data archival framework. The very first one is about a custom fields in out-of-box data archiving scenario. What it means is that you have an extension in the sales line. Let's just take an example of sales order archiving. So you have a custom columns added in the sales line and sales table, and you wanted to add those columns as part of your archiving process. And you want to get the data out in the history table and also out in the Microsoft Managed Data Lake. So that's the option though. How do I handle, and we will talk about in that one, how do I handle that situations. Then we have another situations where it's not about adding a custom columns in existing table, which is part of a data archiving scenario. It's about having a new table altogether as part of the existing archiving scenario. So example, you have sales table, which is sales order archiving scenario, which has around 13 tables. Now you have one more table added in your business, which is holding some data related to either sales table or sales line. And you want that to be added as part of your archiving of sales order. And that's the scenario that we will cover. In the end, and the third point that we have, which is build your own custom archiving scenario. And what it means is that it's about from the ground up, right? So you are not going to use all the existing scenario that we have available. You have a custom solution, custom module, or probably an ISV, right? Where everything is custom and you want to have your own archiving scenario. So like building that archiving scenario from the ground up. And we marked it an asterisk. The reason is that scenario is not available right now in the public preview. We are working on it to publish the guidelines on how do we create your own archiving scenario. That will come up later sometime. Now going next to the option one, which is the adding a custom fields in the out-of-box data archiving scenario. So before we go and talk about, right, the one thing to note, which we also mentioned in the last tech talk that we delivered on 22nd, that against each archiving scenario, we have set of live tables, which are the actual FNO tables. And then against each live table, we have a mapping history table. And then against each, live tables, history tables, we have a mapping BI entity, which we're creating in FNO. And then against those BI entities, we will have a mapping Dataverse virtual entity. So just think about an example of sales order archiving process, which has 13 tables in it. So you can see all the 13 tables listed here. and the mapped history tables, and you can see also the mapped BI entities and the Dataverse virtual entity. Now, this is just an example of sales order. We have posted here in the link a list of all the scenario that is available in the public preview, and they're mapping a list of tables, history tables, BI entity, and the Dataverse. Now, why we are talking about this mapping? Because when we are going to plug in our existing columns, we need to figure out all the list of tables that I have here, because I need to figure out all the extension, customization, or the new column that I have added in these tables. I need to make those tables available in all this three mapping artifact that we have. Now, for me to go, say example that you have a table called sales line _ var, right? Sorry, not just example. Just think about example. In the sales line, you added two extra columns, and those columns you want to be added as part of archiving process. So we'll go to the next, and we'll talk about what are the next steps that you need to do. So the very first step for you to add a custom field in the existing archiving scenario, first of all, the list of mapping that we posted and we discussed in the previous slide, look at that, and you can go manually in the Visual Studio, look at the new column that you have added in your live tables, or you can call it, for example, sales line, right? You have added 4 columns. Make sure that these 4 columns being added into the history table. Now, you can do that 2 ways. One is that we have posted a SQL script that you can log into your dev box, run that SQL script, and the SQL script will validate how many new columns that you have added in the 13 existing tables that is part of sales order archiving, how many new columns that you have added, and those columns are missing in the history table. And that is a script that we delivered. Now, you manually need to consider, when you do a manual mapping, the thing that you need to kind of consider is that there's just 2 columns that we add by system columns that we can call it, sys row version and sys data states, which are the 2 columns there in the live tables. Or you can think about the sales line, sales table, or all tables. These 2 columns are there. You don't need to add these columns into your history. This is columns used by archiving framework for archival. These columns doesn't need to be added in the history table. That's one thing to note, right? That when you are doing a manual mapping, ignore these 2 columns. If you use our script that we have posted, we have already excluded these 2 system columns. Now, there is a question that comes in that why do I need to go all these manual steps? Why can't Microsoft automate it? And we have talked about this one in the past. The one reason is that when you create columns in an existing table, you need to create those columns in extension. You need to define model where you wanted to add those extensions and all the dependencies, right? So automation of that piece is not going to be that easy for us. Again, feedback taken, but right now, the only option that we are left with that we need to do the manual extension. So now, for you to handle the scenario of adding a new column to an existing archive, so validate, right? Because if you're not validating, and if you have a gap between your live table columns and the history table columns, if you try to schedule that archival scenario, it will error out because there's a missing columns, right? So now for you to handle that, validate it. Once it's validated, then create an extension of your history table and add those mapping columns. So the column that is missing, you need to add those columns in the history table, right? Now you have those columns added in the history table, which were there in the live table. Now you need to add those columns and custom fields in your BI entity. And again, why we are saying we keep talking about the BI entity. If you get a chance, or if you attended the last tech talk that we delivered on 22nd, each table in archiving scenario is mapped with one BI entity. We are doing 1-by-1 mapping. So 13 table in sales order archiving scenario, we have 13 BI entities and 13 history tables. So each one, we are doing 1-by-1 mapping to make it simpler of the data copy from FNO to history and from history to the Microsoft Managed Lake. Because if you have a complex entity, it might take a hit on performance, right? So any table that you have customized and you have a custom columns, make sure that corresponding history, you create an extension add those columns, then make sure create a extension to the existing BI entity and add those custom columns. Now, the next step is that I have added all this customization that I need to add. The few things to note, right, that in some of the business scenario, what we have seen is that on the table property on the live tables, you have turned on, or even Microsoft has turned on, created datetime, modified datetime, created by and created and modified by columns. It's either Microsoft has turned on or you have turned on. So if you have a scenario like that, I think you need to pay a little bit attention here. Is that you need to so for history tables, so for archiving framework to copy the data of created datetime, modified datetime, created by, and modified by data to history table. So simply what you need to do is that through extension, go to the history table. If it's not been done by Microsoft, you can just have the property and the metadata turned on, created datetime, created modified datetime. Again, you don't need to. If it's not needed, you don't need to, right? But if you just need it in your scenario, you go and turn on that in history table. In BI entity, you need to manually add those columns, right? So, example, you can see here in the table that we listed, we have created datetime and modified datetime, created by, modified date. BI entity, you need to add created on, sys modified datetime, sys created datetime, sys modified by. Now, we added sys here, right? You don't necessarily need to add a sys here, but what you need to do here is, first of all, do not name the column exactly same as what system creates, right? Like created datetime, you won't be able to add it. So follow your own naming convention. We followed here, added sys. Probably you can add your own naming convention like var modified datetime, but follow the same pattern and same naming convention so that, it's kind of a general guideline for any dev practices that, follow the consistent, the prefix and suffix so that it's a consistent across all the customization extension that we are doing. So now, if you look at, we identified the column, we added those columns into my history and my BI entity. Now, once I have done all these things, I'll deploy that code to my sandbox. So once that code is deployed to the sandbox, the next thing that I need to do is that since I modified my BI entity and underlying table, I want to make sure that my virtual entity in the Dataverse is also being refreshed. And for that, to refresh the virtual entity metadata, simply go to the Maker portal, go to the setting gear, and within that setting gear, you'll see an advanced setting. And in advanced setting, there's an advanced find. And once you open the advanced find, if you have the folks here have used it, or if you have looked, maybe you feel more comfortable. If you have not, I highly encourage look at our docs. And so go to the on this and select finance and operation entities, and then name the entity that you have modified. So, example, in your scenario, you added some custom columns in sales order BI entity, right? So select that entity. I want to select that entity, and then one key things to do here is to check refresh BI entity. So once you check it and save and close, what it's going to do is that it's going to refresh the metadata from FNO to virtual entity with all the changes that you have done by adding new columns or all. Right? So these are the things that you need to do for you to be able to make these changes available. Now, once you do this refresh metadata, now the next thing is what we'll do here is that I'm going to hand it over to Purvesh for a quick demo on the same thing we just talked about. Purvesh, over to you.
Thanks, Ajay, for sharing all the details about how to manage custom fields into the tables related to the data archive scenario. Now it's short time. Let's begin the demo with identification of custom fields. So when we look at the documentation on the setup data archive feature, specifically onto the schedule, the data archive job, very first thing it talk about the validation. It validates for all the custom fields that if you have from the mismatch perspective, if that not been created into the history table. Here that we have published that the link that you need to use the link, and that will take you to the GitHub. Here that the GitHub that the file has been published, you just need to open the file and copy the content and put it into the SQL Server Management Studio. Here that we have listed all the tables that are available as of now, that covers the data archive scenario, that include GL, sales order, inventory transaction, inventory journal, and text trans. The total count is around 38 tables. This list will get increased when we add new scenarios. This list, when I run this job, it will compare that with my live table in the history table, and it gives that the list of all the mismatch fields. So you can have a look at the first from the GL perspective, that created by, modified by are missing in the history table. So those need to be created, right? As Ajay has explained about for the system generated tracking fields. For today's demo, we are going to talk about the sales order archive scenario, the specific field called MSFT test data that we have added in the sales table. So I have a custom field in the sales table. So that custom field need to be created in the history table. So that way it will make sure that we do not have any kind of the field mismatch from the live table and the history table. And the same thing need to be done into the BI entity. So that field need to be created into the BI entity as well. Let's quickly have a look at the Visual Studio. So in this particular example, I have an extension of the sales table, and using that extension, I have created MSFT data field. It's been created in the sales table. So I need to create that field into the history table as well. So using extension of the sales table history, I have added over there, and the similarly sales table BI entity extension I have created to add that the same field into the BI entity field. Okay, so that way I have the custom field created into the history table and into the BI entity. So that made sure everything is in sync. And now let me run that SQL script one more time, and you will notice that the sales order records has been gone because of now there is no longer any kind of the discrepancy from the schema mapping perspective, right? So after that, I just need to generate a build and deploy that particular my change on to the my FNO environment. And after that code has been deployed, as I just explained about that, we may need to perform that the virtual entity into the Dataverse environment. Correct. So let's go to the Maker portal, and using that the Maker portal, I have to just make sure that I have selected the right environment. And after that, just need to click onto the setting gear and then click onto the advanced setting. That will take me to the next screen. And by on this screen, you just need to click onto the advanced find button on the top right corner, and that will open the dialog. That will help me to perform that advanced search. And here that I into the look for the drop down list, I have to search for available finance and operation entities. And then the select, I want to search by the name, and I want to perform the content as a content search. So I want to search by the sales table BI entity, and then click the results. It will give me the results of all the entities that meet that criteria. Here I got the sales table BI entity. So let me click onto the sales table BI entity. That will take me to another dialog that will allow me to perform the refresh of the metadata for that virtual entity. So here that the checkbox is available. You just need to click onto the checkbox, refresh, and then click on save and close. This particular process will take little longer time because of it is going to perform the metadata refresh in your Dataverse. And this is about Ajay has mentioned about the detailed documentation is available on the document site for refresh virtual entity metadata. The steps are similar to the generate the virtual entity in the Dataverse, and the steps, these are the step-by-step approach. It has been explained over here. And that way you will be able to perform that, create that your custom fields, deploy it on your FNO environment, go to the Maker portal, perform that refresh entity, and that way you will be able to include your custom fields into the data archive scenario. So next topic is about the add custom tables in out-of-box archive scenario. Ajay will help us with that journey. Ajay, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, for the demo. Now the next scenario. So as I mentioned in the start of this tech talk, there were three scenarios. Scenario one, to add a columns in an existing archiving scenario, existing tables within that existing archiving scenario. The next one is about I have a new tables and I want to add that new table or plug in that new table in existing archiving scenario. So an example of you have sales line table, which is part of a standard D365, and you have a custom table, probably a sales line underscore var or sales table underscore var, and you want that table to be also added as part of your archiving scenario, right? Or it could be an ISV table, which is also part of your sales order process, and you want that to be also included in an archiving process. Few things that we need to do for plugging in existing tables. The very first thing that we need to do is that create mapping history tables. So for, like we discussed earlier, that for against each table, we have one history table. So what you need to do is that you need to create a history tables against your custom tables, right? And map all the columns, right? When we say map all the columns, again, same thing applies, that there is 2 system columns on every live table, which is sys row version and sys data states, that you don't need to add into the history tables, because those are system columns used by the archiving framework on the live table. We don't need to add those columns on the history. Second is that now I have the history table. The next thing that I need to do is that create my BI entity. As we discussed in the past, against each table, we have a history table and then we have a BI entity. So now I need to create a BI entity against my table and then mirror all the columns, right? All the columns that we have in my live table. And then the third option is now I have my tables created, I have my entity created. The next is to plug in this tables and entity in the existing scenario. But one thing to note, right, when you create history tables, right, you don't need to, you need to mirror all the columns, but please do not create any index on the history table. Because that's one thing that we mentioned in the last tech talk, is that we are moving the data from the live table, our actual FNO table, to a history table, and we are still saving 80% of the space because index to data ratio, right? If you create too many indexes in the history table, then we will kill the purpose. We won't be able to save them as much as we wanted to save, because in any, just example of sales line, there is an 80% index, 20% of data. But the way we are able to save it, that we are moving data to a flat table, history table, with very, very minimal 1 or 2 indexes. That way we are saving around at least 70 to 80% data by just moving to the same table, same database and history table. So just be mindful of that, that we don't need to add any indexes that we have created in your live table to the history table. And then last but not the list is about there's a class that we use to anchor the archiving process, which is archive automation job requester creator class. So you need to extend that class and then plug in that one for you to be able to archive. And we'll do a quick demo on that one. But before we go there, I'll just also talk about the few things on the new table property that we need to do. So on your live table, the table that you are going to add as part of your archiving or BI entity, there is a 2 property of the table metadata. It's called or entity metadata, which is called allow retention and allow archival. You need to enable those 2 properties. As you can see here that we have highlighted, allow archival and allow retention to be yes. Then only these 2 tables will be included in the archiving scenario. So you need to set these two property. Then the other property, which is called allow row version tracking, that needs to be turned on table and the BI entity, right? And now the couple of things here, right? Starting from 39 onwards, if you create a new table, this configuration key for allow row version change tracking is by default turned on, and that property will default set to yes. You can change it to no if you don't want to, but it's default changed to yes. And that column gives us an opportunity and ability to move the data from synchronize the data or changes, incremental changes from your FNO tables to Dataverse. And that is used for both the purpose. It's used for archiving. It's also used for the signups link. Now, one thing to note here is that you don't need to enable allow row version tracking or allow retention and allow archival on history table. It's only on the live table and BI entity. So that's one thing to note, right? You don't need to do that on history table. Right now, we will go and look at, once you have done this metadata setting, right, then we'll go and plug in using, plug in my new tables in the scenario by extending the class here. And I will hand it over to Purvesh to just give a brief overview of the class here that we have created. Purvesh, and then followed by a demo.
Thanks, Ajay. So here is a code snippet that a small piece of the code that need to be added in your solution using the extension of Archive Automation Job Request Creator class. So for the sales order scenario, we have the class that has been created for the sales order Archive Automation Job Request Creator. Using the extension, we have created an extension class, and using the chain of command on create post job request, we are going to first of all make that call to the base method, and that will perform all the activities that need to be done. After that, we will need to define a relation between live table, history table, and the BI entity. So here is just the declaration in terms of the live table, history table. Then we have a SQL name of the live table, the history table, as well as the parent source table name. So in this given example, the parent source table for the sales order archive scenario is sales table. So, and I have a MSFT SO data archive test class table that have been created, and it has a relation with the sales table using the sales ID. So I have a common column between my custom table and the parent table is through sales ID. So very first part of this piece of the code, I'm going to add a relation between live, history, and BI entity. So that way it has been correlated in terms of, because of otherwise that we talk about, like we need three set of the objects, live table, history table, and the BI entity, where they are going to correlate, where they are going to relate to each other. This is the piece of the code that's going to define the relation between those three different objects. Now, the second piece of the code in the same method that I need to define a parent-child relation between my source table, that is the sales table, and my child table, that is the custom table that I have created on MSFT data archive test, the source table. So the relation that I need to define the join condition is through the sales ID. So the sales ID of my table and the sales ID of the sales table is going to define that particular relation, and of course it's going to add the partition condition as well as into the data area ID. So in the SQL representation perspective, we can say that the sales ID of the child table and the sales ID of the parent table and the partition and the data area ID of both the tables will apply the join, and that way that particular using that small piece of the code, you will be able to define the relation between all the live, history, and the BI entity, as well as you will define the relation between the parent-child relation. Keep in mind, this relation that need to be defined, otherwise it is not going to take the table relation that we have defined at the AOT. So it is mandatory to define at the code level the table relation between parent and the child table. So that's it about the small piece of the code I need to add, and that way adding a new table in the existing data archive scenario made very easy. After that, the changes that have been made in the FNO side, we may need to deploy that code. And so that way that FNO environment is up to date with my latest change. Now, what about the database? I need to, and we discussed in that our previous tech talk as well, like how that particular FNO will integrate with the Microsoft Managed Data Lake or the Dataverse Managed Data Lake is through virtual entity. So since that I have added a new virtual entity, the BI entity in the FNO, I may need to generate a virtual entity for that entity, right? So need to follow the similar steps that Ajay just explained about the refresh virtual entity in terms of go to the Maker portal, use the setting here, advanced setting, advanced find, and need to search for available finance and operation entities, and it will give the entity that will appear for MSFT SO data archive test BI entity, and just you need to tick to visible. So that way it is going to enable that the virtual entity into the Dataverse. And as Ajay has explained about the row version change tracking is been enabled for that entity. So I may need to tick that the change tracking is been also been enabled into the Dataverse. The documentation link has been published over here. So using that documentation link, it will give the detailed steps that need to be performed, and you will be able to generate a new virtual entity in our center. After that, the entity has been created into the Dataverse. There is one more additional property need to be set into the Power Platform, into the Maker portal, and that is enable long-term retention. So you need to go to the Maker portal, tables, search for the tables or the virtual entity that we have added, then click onto the properties, advanced options, and you have to make sure like change tracking is enabled and enable long-term retention is also been enabled. Keep in mind, if this particular properties has not been set, system will not allow and will not stop you to trigger that the job, but it will stop into the archival process, because these are the steps is going to perform into the Dataverse. And when that FNO, if you just try to visualize the architectural overview and the diagram that I have explained during that the previous tech talk on May 22nd, we talk about the FNO on the architecture as well as to the Dataverse architecture, right? So all these services will remain in the controller reside into the Dataverse side, and when the service execution will come to the Dataverse side, it will throw an error. So you just need to make sure like you comply to all the steps or the guidance that have been provided to enable the data archive feature into the FNO as well as into the Maker portal or into the Power Platform or the Dataverse. So that way, it's all about like the things that need to be taken care, the objects that you need to be created or that are modified to enable or to add a new table into the existing data archive scenario. Now let's have a quick demo. For this particular the example, I have created the Visual Studio project, and that Visual Studio project contain mainly the 4 objects. Very first thing is about my live table. That is the MSFT SO archive, data archive test. And in this table, I have 2 fields. Sales ID, that will help me to define the relation between the sales table and the test data. That will hold that my data part of this particular the sales ID. So, and I just need to check that the property that Ajay has explained, the table level properties about allow archival, that need to be set to yes. Allow retention, that need to be set to yes. And allow archival and allow retention both are actually related. So as soon as you change the property of one value, it will change the property of another value as well. Now go to the history table. So I just need to create a history table and just need to make sure like both the fields that I have in the live table, it has been created in the history table. Now talk about the BI entity. So I have created the new BI entity, and in that BI entity, I need to set the properties, allow archival, allow retention, and allow row version changed that need to be enabled. So all 3 properties are been set. That means my entity is all set to handle the data archive scenario. So I have that objects has been created in the live table, history table, and the data. Just I need now to talk about the code snippet that we discussed in the previous slide. So I have created the extension of the sales order archive automation job request creator, and using the chain of command, that particular the piece of the code that we have written over here. If you want to add your own custom table, just you need to follow the similar code snippet, and that code snippet is available on our documentation site for to deal with the customization in the data archive scenario. So you just need to take that particular code snippet, and you need to define that particular relation between in a way that it has been explained in this example. So here that I have that my live table, that my history table, and that the SQL name of that my live table, the SQL name of the history table, and the SQL name of that my parent table that has been defined. And the very first part of the code snippet that talk about define the relation between the live history and the BI entity. And the similar thing is gonna explain in terms of that add join condition into the second scenario about that define the relation between live table and the parent of that my live table, that is the sales table. And that's it from the code perspective, because this code is going to take care of that, define the relation between that your live table, history table, the BI entity, and define the relation between your live table and the parent. And this is the small piece of the code, and that will enable you to add your custom tables in the data archive scenario. Once that this particular piece of code has been completed, you just need to create a build and deploy that your solution onto your F&O environment. And then you need to go to the Maker portal, and you may need to enable that the newly created virtual entity into the data house. So we'll follow the similar steps. We'll make sure that I have selected the right environment, then go to the setting here, advanced setting. I'm just going to perform the similar steps that as he has explained in the previous screen about the refresh of the entity here, that we are going to do the generate of the virtual entity by clicking the advanced find. That will open the advanced find dialog, and I will need to search for the available finance and operation entity. And we want to do the search based on the name. I want to do the content search, so I will select the contents and will provide that MSFT. And we'll click onto the results. That will show me the results in the grid. And here I got that my entity, so I just click on it. When this particular the form will be loaded, at this time for the newly created virtual entity, you have to make sure it is ticked for the visible and the change tracking has been ticked. And then click onto the save and close. This particular process is going to once again take some time because of it is going to generate the metadata property. Once that the metadata is generated, you need to go to the tables, all tables, and you may need to search for the entity that we have created. Once you found that particular record, you need to go to the table property and click onto the advanced options, and you have to make sure that the change tracking is enabled and enable long-term retention is being ticked. Once that particular steps has been performed, you are all set from the enabling that your entity into that your Power Platform into that your Power Platform or into the data house. So we talk about the data archival part, right? Now the next question would be like, okay, I done the data archival. How can I see that my data into the Microsoft Managed Data Lake? So to use that Microsoft Managed Data Lake and to perform the inquiry on your onto the data, the cold data that has been stored into the Microsoft Managed Data Lake, you may need to define, you may need to use the Microsoft Fabric. So to use that the Microsoft Fabric, you have to make sure either you should have a trial, the 60 days trial of Microsoft Fabric is been enabled for you, or you have to buy a Fabric capacity using portal.azure.com. The very first thing that you may need to make sure, like the Fabric capacity, it will have a region tag, like in that this Fabric capacity is belong to that region. And the region of the Fabric capacity and the region of your Dataverse environment, it should be the same. If you do not have if there is a mismatch in the region of the Dataverse region and Dataverse environment that has been hosted, and the Fabric capacity system will give you that error message that you do not have appropriate that capacity, Fabric capacity to create a link. How can I create that particular link? So we may need to go to the Maker portal one more time. And using the Maker portal, very first thing, you go to the tables and click onto the Analyze and link to Microsoft Fabric. When you try to do the link first time, it will open the wizard and it will first of all check for the Microsoft Fabric, whether it has been capacity has been available or not. And based on that, the other wizard, that the steps that you need to follow, that will create a link between your Dataverse environment and your Fabric. Once that particular wizard that has been completed, you can use that. You can come one more time into the tables, Analyze and link to Fabric, and that will take you through to the apps.fabric.com or the Power BI, and specifically onto the Lakehouse. That particular the Lakehouse is nothing but it is the shortcut that has been created of the data that has been stored in your Dataverse managed data lake, and it provides you the table view similar to the table browser capability we have in the FNO. Here it shows that all the tables that MSERP underscore the table name underscore table name the BI entity. These are all the BI entities that has been available that has been published into the Microsoft Managed Data Lake. But this is the table browser. How about that if you want to write some sort of the complex queries, or you wanted to have a query kind of that experience? It has been available through SQL Analytics endpoint. So when you will create the link, it will create the Lakehouse, semantic model, and the SQL Analytics endpoint. So using SQL Analytics endpoint, it will give you the similar the look and feel that we have into the SQL Server Management Studio, or that it brings the SQL capabilities in the Fabric. If you just click onto the DBOs, the schema, it tells you through all the tables. And then under the DBO, you will have a view as well. It will allow you to create the new views. Here is that the two queries that I have used for that our today's demo. The first query is about the custom field that we have created in sales table BI entity. Name of the custom field was MSFT data state. So each table and each column will begin with MSERP. That means it's represented that's a ERP data in terms of the tables and the fields. So here that the very first query, I used that the criteria where that MSFT test data with I don't have any that I have a data in it, so that not equal to blank. So when you get that the data, I have added that one more, the group by one MSFT data state code. The value 0, it means it's a live records. Again, I'm referring to that our first session that we talk about the sys data state code value. And the 1, it means the archive records. So I have a 58 archive records, 665 the live records. If for the another example, let me just comment on that MSFT test data. It's a comment out. So, and when I will run the data, when we will run that script one more time, it will give me the complete list of the data in terms of that all the live records and the archive records. So you can see with this data state 0. So without checking that the value of the custom code, and if you just have a look at that the 0 value, 14,536 records. These are the total number of the live records I have in the sales table. And the sys data state code 1 means that archive records. It means that I have archived the 58 sales orders. The second, the query that I have given some sort of the complex example using the custom table that we have created in our demo. That is MSFT SO or data archive test, the BI entity. So I have given that the allies as a child table, and I joined it with the parent table that was the sales table BI entity, and I have applied the join condition that I have written in my code snippet into the code. That is the child table of the sales ID equal the parent table of the sales ID, and I have added the one more criteria to link it with the data area ID. And I did the group by one the data state code, so I can get the segregated view of my live records and the archive records into the custom tables that I have created. So that way you will be able to see this particular, that using the Microsoft Fabric, you can run any kind of the custom queries. You can create the custom queries the way you want. You can create views for those custom queries, and using those custom queries, you will able to create the Power BI reports. So that this particular, either the Fabric, the tables, or the views that you have created in your that the Power BI into the Fabric, you will able to use it into the source of that your Power BI report, and that way you can build your analytic story using the data that has been stored in managed data lake. So that's what all about the two scenarios that we talk during the today's session, that covers the addition of the custom fields and addition of the new table into the existing data archive scenario. Here that we have the reference link that is mentioned in, and that will publish as a part of the tech talk that will help to that our customers and partners as a kind of the easy reference that talk about the archive customization, that mention about that this any kind of how to deal with addition of the custom fields and addition of the new table scenarios. We have detailed documentation available. Let's go through this. Validation, the scripts, the SQL script, it has been uploaded onto our GitHub. That SQL script we will keep on updating as that the new data archive scenarios will added into the scope of the data archive feature. The additional steps about the generate and refresh virtual entity, that will help you take you through the detailed step-by-step approach. And if you need the documentation about the link your Dataverse environment to Microsoft Fabric, the detailed documentation link is also been available. And we strongly recommend our customers and partners to join our Yammer channel. That way you will get on that updates from the engineering team, that any kind of the announcement made by the engineering to that our customers and the partners. We host that the weekly basis that our Yammer the office hours. So if you get a chance, please just download that the schedule from the Yammer channel, and you can book that your calendar.
Hey, thanks, Purvesh. There are a few questions. I know me and Ajay have been taking some of them on the chat, and we have been responding. There are still a few open questions. So I'm going to start off with this one. When accessing the LTR from Fabric, is there any copy from LTR data taken towards a Fabric local data cache? Just wanted to see if there will be some storage requirement on the Fabric side when we access the data, and what would be the effect on licensing on Fabric capacity and Fabric storage requirements.
Great question. So I will start with that your last point in that question about the Fabric capacity. So as I mentioned in that today's demo as well, you can start with the trial capacity by your global admin, because it need to be enabled at the tenant level. If you have consumed that the 60 days of the trial by your organization, you may need to buy your own Fabric capacity. When you buy the Fabric capacity, it starts with F1 to F22, I believe, from the higher number perspective. So it depends on your requirement, because of that Fabric capacity will have direct correlation to that your storage and your compute. Right. So if you are dealing with the terabytes of the data in your archival, and if you want to deal with, probably you may need a higher tier of the Fabric capacity compared to the lower tier. So the testing, it start with tier 0, that is the F0, and you have an option to start with the F1 or F2. So that way, it will help you to determine that, what capacity you need for that to deal with the Microsoft Fabric. As of now, using the Microsoft Fabric, you will able to, because as I mentioned in the demo as well, when you create link to Fabric, it create a shortcut into the Fabric. In that shortcut, it will take you to the Microsoft Managed Data Lake, data stored into the Microsoft Managed Data Lake. And here it will just help you to show the data in terms of the visual representation in terms of tabular data, or you can write a SQL query, but again, it will go and run onto your Microsoft Managed Data Lake. So that way, since it is a shortcut, the benefit is you are always dealing with the live record. When I say the live, it means the latest updated data in Microsoft Managed Data Lake, no caching at this particular moment.
Yeah, I think the cost is like we're not copying the data, so probably the cost is only associated of the Microsoft. It's just a shortcut that you are using in your Fabric. If you plan to bring the data out, that's where the cost will come up. Right now, we have not been finalized in the model of the storage cost, like in terms of segregating the live data, archive data, how frequently you are reading, and because it also comes with like number of APIs call that you can make, right? So all the Fabric capacity is also linked with the number of calls on the compute. So the costing perspective, yes, there will be some impact on your Fabric capacity cost, and depends on how you want to read and how much data you want to read. But right now, from the costing perspective, from FNO side, we have not been able to finalize it during the preview.
Yeah, so stay tuned and join our Yammer community. So that way, any particular announcement that has been made in that particular area, that will help you to keep up to date. But definitely, before that, the GA of the feature, all those things that will be sorted out, and you will have a clarity. So licensing perspective, I'm sorry, Harish, I just wanted to add one more point from the licensing perspective. There is no cost to enable the data archive. Of course, there is a cost when you will run the data archival and the data is been archived records that has been stored into the managed data lake that will get counted into your Dataverse capacity. Once again, I'm taking the reference of the slide that Ajay has explained during the first tech talk about the FNO capacity. Similar that we have a Dataverse capacity, and all the archive records will be shown under Dataverse capacity, and you can easily identify those records because the name of the table will end with retain. That means these are all the archive records, and the capacity has been shown under the Dataverse capacity report.
Thanks, Purvish. There are a couple of other questions. When LTR data moved from FNO to Fabric, is there a storage we need to have by in Dataverse? I think you kind of addressed around the storage, so probably it will be a follow-up to that and address this one, Purvish.
Yeah, so data moved from FNO. Okay, again, we'll take you through the first session where we explain about the data flow. Data flow from FNO live tables to the Microsoft Managed Data Lake. Fabric is provide kind of the link, create a shortcut, and that way you always querying into the Microsoft Managed Data Lake. The data has been stored in Microsoft Managed Data Lake.
Okay. Hey, there's another question. Could you confirm only Fabric is used, or could we use Synapse to read the information from Microsoft Managed Data Lake?
Microsoft Managed Data Lake is a SaaS solution. So compared to the BYOL, that you do not have direct access to the data, right? So currently, that the Fabric is the way that allow you to create a shortcut, and you get that way you can perform the query onto the data Microsoft Managed Data Lake.
Thanks.
At this moment, and using the Fabric, it will allow you to write a complex the queries or create a complex view the way you want. And you can save it, and then you can use it into the Power BI report for your reporting purpose.
There's one more question. Are the schema and relations from T-Test to FNOs getting reflected on Fabric? Will the schematic model contain those relations out of box?
So like to relate that particular at the service level, I just explained about that, it performed the validation, right? So definitely when you make any kind of the schema change in FNO, you need to perform the refresh of the virtual entity in the that it triggers the change of the schema into the managed data lake as well. So that way it will always in a sync through the Power Platform or through the Dataverse changes or through virtual entity changes.
Yeah, so we don't maintain the relationship what we have in FNO in the Dataverse, right? So it's an entity model. So that relation is not flowing to Dataverse. There is one question which is related to attachments. What about attachments if we expect to archive and visualize them as well? So right now, attachments, it's there in our doc. It's not supported. However, we are already discussing about it to move those attachments to history table. So you can view it from the history. As you know, that attachments are stored in the doc ref table. with the blob storage link. So we can just reference back to the history table. So from history table inquiry, you can look at those attachments. Moving those attachments to blob out from FNO or from the LTR right now, it's not been prioritized. We have been discussing it, but the option of having attachment available in the history table for you to inquiry is something that we are already working on it.
So we'll try to make sure that you have a seamless experience that you have into the live, when you deal with the live records, when that it move to the history table, you will have a document attachment functionality through the history tables or through inquiry forms.
There's another one. We also need to be able to clean up data from LTR. Is that functionality also available to set up some export from LTR and afterwards remove from LTR based on query or selection criteria?
Great question. So Microsoft is already working on it. There are some sort of the APIs that will detailed documentation that will publish on that particular area, and using those just from the heads up perspective, that will be some sort of the APIs that will be published. Using that API, because 10 years down the line or 15 years down the line, that even that you don't need the data in your core data storage as well, right? So you may need to even the delete or the purge the data from your Microsoft Managed Data Lake as well. So we'll provide the APIs, and using those APIs, you will be able to do it in a future.
Great.
So purging perspective, I'm sorry, I'm just cutting you. But so purging perspective, we discussed in that our previous tech talk, the purge, the Microsoft currently working on the purge of that your history table. So using the purge, you will be able to delete the data from your history tables. That is then AXDB, FNO side of the data. But that using the APIs, that you will be able to delete that your data side of the data.
I think probably this one will be the last question we can take today. What happens if we go beyond the limitations that are set to access the LTR data? Will the query be blocked, or will there be slower access time, or there will be some additional charges calculated and invoiced towards the customer?
So we have currently that the limit that has been applied for that the public preview is the 100 million, but that is to schedule the data archive job. There is no limit in terms of the ones that you schedule archive job and it has been performing. There is no limit in terms of that any higher capacity, right? If it has been enabled for you and you are testing, or even in your production environment when you run the data archive job, whatever the data is there in your live table, we move to your data archive. So the capacity perspective, the storage perspective, whatever the data you move into your managed data lake, it will get counted against the managed data and Dataverse capacity report. So, but that doesn't mean that it will stop you.
And just to add a bit, right, even today, we are not stopping. So if you are on overage on the capacity, whether it's the Microsoft Managed Lake capacity or your overage on FNO database capacity, certain features won't work if you're over. Like, for example, if you want to get a new environment, you won't be able to do it because you are over on the capacity. So we don't stop you to do archiving. Let's say, example, you're doing archiving for sales order, you want to do for other scenario. You can continue to do it, but it's going to be an accumulated cost for your invoice next time. In terms of reading the data, right? So if you are using Fabric, and if you are using, let's say, example F2 that Purvesh mentioned, which has only two or four CPU cores. So if you need more data to process, it's going to be slower and slower. So that's where we need to move to the higher tier to read the data faster. But yes, the cost is not going to stop you to archive, but it's going to be included into your invoice for the storage overage.
Thanks, Ajay and Purvesh. Probably one last one. When do we expect the GA release date for this feature?
Great question. So currently, engineering team is working on finalizing that the GA date. We have tested with many customers. I can say 30 plus the customers, and the segment, different size, different geography, and we received the really good feedback. And engineering team is working on finalizing the GA date. Probably, so stay tuned. And just once again. Just join the Yammer group so that you will have an update. Probably it will be in June release in terms of the GA date. Otherwise, it will be the 10. So either it is 10.40 or 10.41, and that will declare the GA.
Yeah, and the GA are based on the scenario. The scenario that
Yes.
preview will go to GA in the next cycle. Scenario those are going to come out in the private preview or public preview. It might come GA in the later releases. Like retail is the one which we're still working on. So it's not going to be GA in 40 or 41. It might come up with GA in the next releases.
Yeah. And again, just talking about the limit that I mentioned about the 100 million. So probably on the safeguard perspective, that Microsoft Engineering will decide to GA with a lower limit, and then that limit will get extended up to some limit at periodic interval.
Yeah, even today you have an option to go ahead and extend it, right? If there is the larger scenario, I think the option is
That,
you guys to reach out to us.
We need to, yes. Yeah. So we need to reach out to the engineering team. So feel free to reach out to either Harish, Ajay, and me. We will help you. First of all, we may need to review that your data growth in that particular environment that you have said. Engineering team will review this data growth and then will help us to extend that limit, even that if you want to test in the public preview.
Yeah, we are over 4 minutes, but just to add a bit on that one, this the cap that we added is not about it's not a hard cap. This is kind of a service production you can think about, right? That initial might take longer if you go with more than 100 million. Again, it doesn't mean that if you have more than 100 million, you can't archive it. That's where you have to reach out to us, right? Or come to our Yammer channel, and then we can have it enabled for you.
Correct. And another reason that cap has been enforced is if your database size is around 5 to 6 terabyte, right? And you have 100 or around the terabyte or the billions of record in one of the table. And if you want to run it using your tier 2 the environment, definitely tier 2 will not be capable enough to handle that load, even to the query. Forget about the other thing, right? So that our recommendation, even that in our documentation, we have clearly mentioned, like if you are crossing the 100 million, you may need a higher tier of your sandbox. That way you will, so that your sandbox environment should capable enough to sustain and handle that particular load.
Thanks, Ajay. Thanks, Purvesh, for that. Coming to a close of this session, I posted a short URL in Q&A panel. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's session and what you'd like to see